r/AskReddit. For those who have careers that keep them out at sea for long periods of time, what is the creepiest thing you've seen out in the water? Some 20 years ago, on the MV Explorer, since sunk, down near the Antarctic Circle, sailing around the bergs and occasionally making landfall, we rounded into a small bay area, and there, amongst the ice and coast was an unmarked sailing yacht, which is odd as generally yachts had some identifying markings on them. To add to it, they didn't respond to any radio contact, and whilst I wasn't privy to the conversation, and it was a long time ago, some crew went across via Zodiac, and were refused boarding. So basically a yacht, not a particularly large one, that was unmarked, was hanging around in the inhospitable waters of the Antarctic, and didn't want any help or contact. Proper weird. Somewhere in the Atlantic, nice cold as duck night, decided to step out and look at stars. About 10 minutes on and a boat's mast pops up, sits there a few minutes, and then back under. No alarms, nothing. Just some sub boys getting a bit of late night O2 in the middle of nowhere next to some friends. This sort of qualifies. Former Navy here. Somewhere off the coast of Italy saw a very small boat, not much bigger than a rowboat, about 9 or 10 miles offshore. This was sometime around midnight. There was no light from land, and no other ships around. It had a light. Our ship captain said it was a fisherman, and the fish would be attracted to the light at that time. Imagine being in a rowboat about 10 miles offshore in the middle of a pitch black night, waiting to see what finds you. A dead human body. It was the tropics, and it wasn't in good shape. We turned it over to the authorities at nearest land. There were enough teeth left to identify it by dental records. Here's hoping the man's family got closure. Creepiest thing I've seen has definitely been seeing myself and other crewmates lose our minds. On one particularly awful voyage, everything that could go wrong went wrong, and we found ourselves without food, water, and sleep for a very unhealthy amount of time. It started off with auditory hallucinations. Ships are noisy, and when you're going crazy, you begin to think those noises are talking to you. I heard children laughing, a choir singing, and creepiest of all, a particular splash sounded like it was calling my name from the sea. Combine that with visual hallucinations, and then things get really terrifying. I was convinced we were in the desert at one point with sand all around us, and mountains in the distance. Another crew member freaked out, and told us we were about to run into an apartment building. The creepiest thing I saw was an all-black flying pig with red eyes on the bow. I think the scariest though was when someone was convinced we lost part of our crew overboard. It turned into a massive delirious argument over where everyone was, even though we were all accounted for. That trip was brutal, and the captain put us all in a terrible situation due to sheer incompetence. Other than that, there was this one time I saw 3 gigantic ships in the distance with no lights and they did not show up on AIS. Suddenly they were gone. It was extremely creepy. Not so much what I saw, but what I experienced. I was once underway in the Gulf of Alaska during a November gale. Waves were up to 35 feet with some rollers hitting 45. An uncommon occurrence on the diesel electric ship I was on was a cycloconverter tripping. When this happened, the ship would temporarily completely lose power and propulsion until some electricians could reset everything. This happened during that gale. I simply can't explain how strange it is for the boat you're on to all of a sudden go so quiet that you can clearly hear waves slapping the ship and metal bending and flexing. Knowing you're completely at the mercy of the sea. Knowing that if the ship lost its bearing and went beam to, there was a real possibility of capsizing. It's easy to forget, when you're at sea, that the only thing keeping you alive is a bunch of steel welded together. At that moment I was fully aware, and it humbled me. Thankfully we trained frequently for this, and had everything fired back up relatively quickly. Another time I recall was when the ship took a rogue wave. They are absolutely real, and I believe they account for a massive number of shipwrecks. It was late at night, and I was on the bridge. We were passing through a storm and we are taking the waves off the bow with no visibility. As the ship moves, there's normally a pretty standard pattern. You ride up a wave for a bit, and then you fall down the wave for a bit. Well, we started riding up a wave, and got to the point where we should have been starting, or ride down, but we just kept climbing and climbing, and then it happened. We started our ride down the back of this massive wave. All of us braced ourselves and tried to find something to hold on to, but we all fell to the deck anyway. Anything that wasn't secured for sea fell down all around us. Manuals, tables, computers, printers, you name it. Our captain, who was sleeping, called up to the bridge asking if we hit something. It woke the entire crew up. Rogue waves are real, and they are terrifying. I can't imagine being in a smaller boat or taking one of them broadside. I was in the US Navy for about 10 years and have tens of thousands of miles at sea in an aircraft carrier. Countless nights on the flight deck in the middle of the night and middle of the ocean. Creepiest, a huge patch of the ocean glowing. Like nuclear waste in The Simpsons glowing. I've seen bioluminescent algae of a few kinds and this was nothing like it. I've never seen anything like it before or since. Weirdest thing, hundreds of miles out to sea from land and there was a massive fire on the water. It was like the top of a gas refinery, but on the water with nothing under it but water. Flame going a few stories into the air. Saddest, a fellow sailor trying to jump overboard. He apparently got a Dear John email and pictures from his cheating wife and decided to end it. We were on the smoke deck. He bummed a cigarette, then asked the time. We said 2300. He replied, sounds like a good time to die, and in one motion tried to launch over the chest high wall with an opening to the water below. Luckily we were faster than him. We grabbed his legs and wrestled him down and laid on him and basically hogtied him till the MAs, Navy cops, got there. Broke my heart because he was a good dude. I never saw him again. He got transferred off the ship shortly after. Not sure what happened to him, but I hope he's doing better. I used to be an oilfield diver in the Gulf of Mexico. I'd say about 80% of the dives I logged were at night. Mostly 500 feet and under DSVs. It's very eerie feeling sitting on the downline doing in-water decompression in the middle of night. I'd always ask topside to turn off my headlight. Like a worm on a hook. Just bobbing in the darkness. Years ago my friends and I visited Thailand and went on several excursions on a boat with a captain. On one of the evenings we were out at night and it was pitch black except for the green lights that were coming from the large commercial fishing boats way out in the distance. We had stopped for a while to take in the view and eat when it started to rain. The captain thought it was best to head back and then quickly realized that the boat propeller wasn't working and something was caught on it. He grabbed his head-mounted flashlight and a knife and jumped in the water. He was gone for a good minute, which felt like eternity as we were huddled around trying to figure out what was happening. Fear started kicking in as we waited. Then he suddenly re-emerged panting and told us that shortly after he jumped in, he lost his flashlight and had to literally feel his way underwater towards the propeller, reaching and cutting a plastic tarp that had wound itself around the propeller, cut it loose, and made his way back to the surface in the dark. It was a strange set of emotions as we were completely impressed with the badass display we just witnessed, relieved he made it back but also freaked out imagining what would have happened if he hadn't. One night on the 00 to 04, watching the Persian Gulf on a military transport, the whole sky went from pitch black of 0200 to fully lit in a second. This went on for about 30 seconds then back to pitch black. We called up the neighboring ships and HQ, no one knew what happened. Our best guess was a meteor. Second story was a couple years before the first, cruising around the Philippines and see nothing at all visual and on radar. All of a sudden we see a faint white light about 100 yards off our port bow. Typically we don't let anything get within a mile of our ship. Grab the pinnace and head to the bridge wing and there is just a little banker boat with his outboard motor and a flashlight. Even with radar, NVGs and an infrared camera we couldn't see this guy's little 20-foot boat in a 6-foot sea without lights on. Obviously more crazy stuff than creepy in my career so far. The people are the craziest thing you will experience at sea. Had one guy who wouldn't go outside the skin of the ship at night because the aliens would abduct him. Again. Nothing too extensive like some of the stories here, but I worked as a tuna fisherman for a tiny bit, where I'd spend 3 to 4 weeks out at a time, taking around 3 days of 24-hour travel to get where me and one other person, the captain who was a 5th generation fisherman, were fishing. So many stories of insane things that I could be here all night, but one was near the end of the season, and we pushed out farther than we should have, over 100 nautical miles, where we had no business being as a 37-foot trawler. and then we are caught in a bad storm. I had barely enough time to, very carefully, board up all of the windows before the boat started scooping when coming down one of the 12-foot waves. The first third of the boat dives underwater before popping back up, only to travel up another wave and do it again and again as waves got larger and things got worse. Basically, the captain and I stayed the cabin, bracing ourselves with each wave, staring at the radar in hopes we could stay in the position of taking the waves head on and avoid being capsized. After a few minutes, and the fear that this 5th generation fisherman was exuding, I just accepted that I was going to die there, and the experience of that acceptance, and the event itself, had a profound effect on my perception and the way I've lived life afterward. We eventually made it out, and didn't say a lot to each other afterward. Lots of stories from that time, but this was the creepiest, I'd say. I sailed on the American aircraft carrier USS George Washington in 2000 and 2002. A couple of things I remember are pulling into Lisbon, Portugal for a port visit. Carriers can't pull pierside in Lisbon, so we had to take boats back and forth. I was looking down at the water and there wasn't a square inch that didn't have a jellyfish in it. We were sailing through a giant bloom of them and all I could think of is if someone could survive if they fell in. The USS Cole was part of our battle group. We left her behind in the Red Sea while we went through the Suez Canal. Once we entered the Mediterranean Sea, the Admiral went on the 1MC ship speaker system and told us that a rib boat had hit her and blown a hole in the side. About a month later we were pulling into Palma, Spain when a rib boat came barreling towards us. The security detail was called on deck and they were ready to blow them out of the water. The commanding officer quickly told them to not shoot. It turned out to be Greenpeace. For the next 5 hours Greenpeace and hundreds of their friends circled the ship in their boats and jet skis. Those guys probably had no idea how close they came to getting killed that day. Sailing across the Atlantic, especially in the winter, can get intense. Carriers have advanced stabilization capabilities because the flight deck needs to be safe for landing. Even with that, there are times where the ship bobbed around like a cork. I was once deployed to a Taiwanese high seas drift net vessel as a fisheries observer. The vessel I was placed on would deploy their net and the crew would then seek a few hours sleep. They usually got no more than 5 or so hours when actively fishing. Often, though, the captain would stay up and hand jig for squid, which he dried and packed away. One night, however, I got up to take a leak and no one was awake. We were 1500 miles from the nearest land, about equidistant between Midway and the Aleutians. The waters were calm and the moon lit the sea under a partly cloudy sky. I went out to the rail and began pissing overboard. The ship began to rock. It was moments before I realized that a monstrous ducking container ship was passing to our stern by less than 100 yards. The ship was so large it covered my whole field of view. To this day I wonder if someone aboard that vessel had been paying attention, because I guarantee you we were not. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.